let's get started because we have only 1 hour. We're very excited to have you guys for this behind the scenes seminar with Kalina Manova. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a behavioral economist at Oxford. I'm doing this seminar series with Vatsal, who is a behavioral development economist at Exeter. And today we're really thrilled to have Kalina Manova, who is at UCL, who's worked on trade and thinking about exports, innovation, using a range of techniques. And she's going to tell us about the journey of one of her ambitious projects on trade and management. And before she gives us a short presentation, we would like to go a little bit over the format. So Vatsal is going to walk us through the logistics.
All right, thank you, Seth. And thank you, Kalina, for joining us and for making time for this. So the way this works is Kalina is going to give us an introduction to the paper for around 10 to 15 minutes, after which I will share the link of a survey with all of you. And the survey will basically elicit your priors about the behind the scenes of the paper. You'll have some time to fill the survey. Sev and Kalina will have a conversation at that time. And then I'm going to share my screen and show you your responses and then Kalina's responses to those very questions as well. So all of you would have seen the consent form that I had shared. Because we're collecting data, we need to go through consent. For those of you who haven't had the chance to look at it, I've posted the link to the consent form in the chat. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So in around 10 to 15 minutes, I'll share the link to the survey. Kalina, over to you. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to join you. And what a fantastic idea to have such a workshop that kind of opens the curtains and you can kind of peek behind. It was a bit of a challenge for me to pick a paper because I wanted it to be accessible to a very broad audience. And I also wanted it to be illustrative, to kind of be a starting point for discussing various issues that come up in the process of writing a project. So hopefully I chose correctly. I'll make this full screen, which means I probably won't see you. So if anything comes up, you should just feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so hold on. I'm gonna hide these. Okay, so this is a project that was joined with several people spanning 3 continents. So that already was an interesting experience. So Nick Bloom was a colleague of mine at Stanford, and Stephen San was a student of ours at Stanford. Then, John Van Wienen was one of Nick's longstanding co-authors, and Jihan was someone I had worked with. And so the project thinks about the relationship between management practices and international trade. And it's motivated by 2 open questions. So you start with the observation that if you just look across firms and countries, there's just dramatic heterogeneity in participation in the global economy, but also in productivity and management practices. And if you think about open questions in the trade literature, there is a bit of a black box around the notion of productivity. So we are used to thinking about firm heterogeneity being absolutely instrumental to explaining trade participation, multinational activity, global value chains, but we model it as an exogenous firm drop that just kind of drops from the sky. Empirically, there are a lot of serious trade economists who are very careful about measuring TEFP, but of course in our models, it's conceptually speaking kind of a quantity-based measure of how productive you are, and in practice, it's a bit of a black box. It's a residual of something you don't observe directly, and it's prone with different kind of revenue-based estimation issues. So I think the question in the trade literature is what is behind this black box, and from a policy perspective, what is actionable? Then there's a separate literature in management, which is interested in understanding how management practices translate into firm performance. So there's this old notion that a good management is good for firm productivity and profits. There's been more recently interest in kind of what good management entails. But there's been relatively little work on unpacking the mechanisms through which management operates. The notion is that management is good for lean manufacturing, so essentially producing at low cost, but also for quality control, so capacity to produce high quality goods. So what we try to do in this paper is to actually bring those two literatures together. And we want to provide the first evidence on the role of management practices for firms' export performance, and in the process shed light on both of these open questions. The project started out with empirical work, and then we disciplined it with a stylized model. So we made use of really great data for the world's two largest export economies, China and the US. And for each country, we had very rich data at the plant level on kind of standard balance sheets and production outcomes, which we can match to really rich customs data, so transaction level information on international trade, imports and exports. What's novel is bringing in management practices. So these are based on surveys and census for the US. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And so armed with this data, we established some novel stylized facts, which motivated us to kind of think about them through the lens of a standard heterogeneous firm trade model. What's interesting is that we found very similar patterns for China and the US, despite their very different income levels, institutional structure, and market frictions, which made us realize that it really informs kind of more fundamental economic mechanisms. And it's not just specific to a given institutional context. And more broadly, we think it says something about this policy notion of what makes a country or a firm competitive. So what are the results in a nutshell? We see that firms with more effective management practices are better exporters. And this is reflected anywhere you look. So they have a higher probability of being exporters in the first place, and conditional on exporting, they have higher export revenues, they enter more markets with more products and so on. What allows better managed firms to perform better is that they can access imported inputs more effectively in order to be both more efficient in terms of producing at lower marginal cost, but also in terms of producing higher quality goods. So to get at these mechanisms, we exploit the rich transaction data from the customs records. Looking at firms' export performance, we could look at the prices they're charging, and using information on both quantity and prices, we can infer quality as well as quality adjusted prices. And when we do that, we see that better managed firms sell higher quality at lower quality adjusted prices. And to validate this, we then also look at the inputs that they buy from abroad. We do not observe domestic input purchases, but in terms of imported inputs, we can look at those inputs prices, quality. We could look at where those inputs are coming from in terms of how many different origins, what are the characteristics of those origins. And what we deduce from that analysis is that better managed firms are using high quality inputs. They also appear to use more complex assembly processes in the sense that they are kind of combining multiple inputs to produce a more sophisticated final good. So in terms of the policy lessons we drew from this study, we quite like the idea that management is something very concrete and tangible. It can be directly measured. And so we think of it as an important ingredient of what we might think of TFPQ. We do learn that good management matters for both efficiency and quality capacity. And then if you think about policy lessons for developing countries, the emphasis is on improving competitiveness. And here we kind of demonstrate that you can achieve that by improving management practices. So it's not a black box of productivity, but it's something concrete. And actually, the World Bank has been working on managerial know-how much more recently, and not just thinking about credit constraints or access to foreign technology. Okay, so given the nature of this talk and what its purpose really is to kind of enable a discussion what happened behind the scenes, right? I'll keep this brief. So I'm going to skip the theory completely. So if any of you are familiar with the trade literature, I can give you kind of a quick summary. It's a Mellitz type model where there's heterogeneous firms with different productivity levels, which means marginal costs, and they can endogenously choose their input quality. Higher quality inputs are more expensive, and therefore, in equilibrium, more productive firms are going to choose to produce higher quality goods. They'll be selling them at higher prices, but in terms of quality adjusted prices, they will still be lower. And with fixed costs of exporting by destination product market, you're going to get a lot of standard predictions that Better managed firms are the ones that can enter more markets, sell more products, have higher revenues and profits. So really, it is a standard model of trade with a quality margin. I've done a couple other projects leading up to this one that introduce those models. And really, we use it to organize the empirical analysis. So I'm just going to go straight to the empirical analysis, where you can think of management competence, management practices as the metric of productivity in the model. So where does the data come from? So Nick and John started running these world management surveys in the early 2000s. And by now they have vetted many more countries. So the slides I'm using are obviously a few years old. So these are surveys that are based on the McKinsey assessment practices. They talk to plant managers. They have great endorsements by places like the World Bank and a bunch of central banks. And they essentially collect information on 18 management practices. Half of those go after how you manage physical capital, and half of them are how you manage human capital. So on the physical capital front, it's about how you set production targets and then how you monitor progress towards those targets and potentially adjust as needed. So you want to set realistic targets that are integrated across different production stages, and you want frequent data collection and analysis. In terms of managing human capital, it's all about incentive provision. So you want to reward high performance and you want to find pathways to improve low performance. Now, for the vast majority of countries, this was done by these phone interviews. For the US, for the first time, they were able to incorporate these questions into the census, which meant that, of course, you're going to get a lot more firms responding, and coverage is really key when you're trying to unpack these mechanisms. So here is a figure showing you a firm that has a plan that has really good performance metrics, different production stages are delineated with these yellow lines, and you have clear scoreboards on the floor, on the production floor, to help you keep track of everything. And I think this was Toyota US, and this is sort of a random textile plant in India where things are really, really messy, and they had really poor inventory practices, and they had no idea what was going on these different stations. So I skipped model, but I will show you a few tables. The point is to show you kind of how we thought about empirical analysis. And of course, these are not labeled appropriately for such a presentation, okay? I'm making references to propositions that I have not shown you. We should never do that. But I was trying to be quick here. So essentially, what we always did was study China and the US separately, different sample sizes, because for China, this is based on these world management surveys. For the US, it's based on the census, many more firms. And we started by looking at, the probability of exporting and then export sales conditional on exporting. I won't bother you with these and fixed effects, but we were quite careful with, say, sector, province, year fixed effects, a bunch of noise controls, controlling for different firm attributes and the such. And what we documented consistently is that more effective management practices are associated with superior export performance. Now, you'll notice how my language, we talk about that during the debrief. And you'll also notice that, on the slide on top, I don't have a directional arrow from management going to export probability and global exports, but rather it's two-sided. And we'll discuss why that is. So in our mind, we think of productivity driving these export outcomes. So we need to come back and discuss, well, what is management competence? Is it a metric of productivity, or is it an endogenous choice of management practices, which is pinned down by some other firm primitive, and therefore sort of a joint outcome of the firm's maximization problem. Therefore, what I'm showing you are just correlations, okay? We break it down into different margins of export expansion, looking into number of destinations, number of products, and sales per market. This is informative from a modeling perspective because it tells you whether there are fixed or variable costs floating in the background. Then we start thinking about these different channels through which management practices operate. The takeaway from this analysis is to document the importance of both production efficiency and quality capacity. Okay, so I anticipated that already, but you could be a bit agnostic, or you could, lean into the model. We've done different things. I'm showing you some of that here, which is a bit more model driven. So there is a model consistent measure of quality that you can back out from observed data on prices and quantities at the transaction level with some assumptions on elasticities of substitution. So when you do that, you can then essentially correlate management scores with export quality proxies, quality adjusted prices, and just export prices. And you see the magnitudes as well as the significance, and you can kind of draw some conclusions by comparing them across countries. And so what we consistently observed is that better managed firms are more capable in terms of both higher quality capacity and better production efficiency. The elasticities are much higher for China than the US. China has, on average, a much lower level of management practices and much greater dispersion around that mean. That's generally true of developing countries compared to the advanced West. And so we think this elasticity is a reflection of that. That if you think about market competition, how well you do is going to depend on how good you are, but also how bad your neighbors are. And so the returns to more effective management practices might well be a reflection of, how competitive the market is. Then finally, let's not just lean onto the output prices. What can we gauge from input sourcing? Can we learn more about input quality and production complexity by using the information on firms' import behavior in the data? And kind of we looked at different metrics here, very much driven by what had been done in the literature to that point. The literature on trade and quality, I mean. So we see that the better managed firms are the ones that are sourcing more imports from abroad in the case of China, not in the case of the US. So that's consistent with the idea that essentially inputs produced in richer countries tend to be of higher quality. And so for Chinese firms, it's very important to source inputs from abroad if they want to operate at a high level. For the American firms, not necessarily, because they also have access to great stuff at home. Average origin income is correlated with management. So that is consistent with the idea that better managed firms are sourcing higher quality inputs. And you can also look directly at input prices or quality inferred from input prices, which I guess I'm not showing on this slide. And then finally, if you think about input quality, it could be that, if you make a silk dress, silk is more expensive than if you make a cotton dress. Cotton is cheaper, and we might think of the silk dress as being higher quality. But alternatively, you could also think of product complexity. So think of a printer, scanner, fax machine. That's probably made of many, many, many parts. Whereas if it's just a fax machine or a printer, it's made of many fewer parts. So you can also gauge complexity by looking at the range of inputs that these firms assemble into a single output product. And that's what we were getting at here. We were counting the number of different products that these firms were sourcing from different countries of origins, adjusting for the number of their output products. So I kind of want to wrap up soon. And let me flag a couple of things we added as the project evolved. So one of them was to try to push on the direction of causality instead of just leaving it at correlations. So Nick and John had done some management interventions in India. And as we were working on this project, they went back to the field to study the long-term effects of those interventions, kind of 8 years after management consulting was offered to a bunch of Indian firms. And so what they confirmed is that even 8 years after, there were some kind of, lasting benefits from this management consulting. So think of it as there being control firms who got no consulting and treatment firms. For the treatment firms, they had multiple establishments. Even within a treated firm, some plans got the intervention, some plans didn't. Short term, it looked like the benefit was really big for the intervention plans in the treatment firms, but there was some knowledge spillover, you might describe it that way, to kind of the non-intervention plans in the treatment firms as well as the control plans. Long term, it seems like the intervention really benefits the treated firms, and there is convergence in that benefit across treated and initially not treated plans, consistent with kind of management competence kind of being contagious in a way. And so what we also did was, okay, the gist of the paper was about China and the US, because that's where we had really rich data. But we wanted to look at this causality. So we explored the Indian data for many fewer plants and firms and very few metrics of export activity, but at least we had causality. So there we kind of saw that kind of 8 years later, the firms that had gotten the initial management consulting treatment were more likely to be exporting at higher export intensity. We also did something by exploiting the time dimension in the US panel data. We could not do this for China because there the survey had been done only cross-sectionally. And then the last thing that we were prompted to do, and again, I'm going to talk about the refereeing process, was to try to say something more about the relationship between management competence and TFPR. And we ended up being non-conclusive there. So one possibility is that TFPR and management competence are just, in principle, they're going after the exact same thing. That's TFPQ, but both are measured with noise. They're imperfectly correlated, and therefore both enter multicollinearly in the regression. An alternative interpretation is that there are two dimensions to firm success. One of them is the management practices they adopt, and then there's something else that has to do with their TFP that's not fully absorbed by this management competence, and therefore both of these dimensions matter for their expert performance. So I'll stop here and say I think we learned a lot from this project that kind of unpack the mechanisms through which management practices help firms become better from the management field perspective. And then from the trade perspective, we kind of figured out what is behind this black box of productivity. And the policy action point here is that management upgrading helps. And so kind of at the time, thinking about future work, we thought it will be useful to then think about how management practices matter for multinational activity and value chains, kind of going beyond the simple activity of exporting or importing inputs. So let me stop share here. I think that was plenty. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kalina, for this great presentation that shows really the many layers, many parts to the project, and will be very rich and very interesting to discuss the various components. So Vassal just shared the link to the survey, and we're going to have just a short chat with Kalina while you guys are filling out the survey. I'm going to ask first one question, but if there is any question from the audience after this one, please just leave it in the chat, and we'll take it there. So you already mentioned that the co-authorship team was spread out across the planet, more or less. And so I would like to ask you a little bit how this team was formed. You left some clues, but I think it's kind of interesting to kind of think about the various components, how they came together. And I would like to ask, how do you choose your co-authors? I mean, in this project and more generally, how do you think about that, these research teams?
Yeah. I think in our profession, who you work with should bring you joy. I mean, it should make papers better, but it should also be kind of fun and rewarding. And I think these co-author relationships always develop organically. So I think that's generally true of my different projects. In this particular case, I remember when I first joined Stanford, I was kind of alone, the only trade economist, but I did have a lot of point of overlaps with many colleagues. And Nick Bloom was somebody I was talking to from the start. And we also, I think, clicked in terms of personalities. I went to Europe for various conferences. I wanted to broaden my network beyond the US, and that's how I met Ji Hong. So this happened fairly early on when I was tenure track. And one thing led to another, and we kind of started working together really, really well. He had access to the Chinese data at the time that he was kind of one of the first. And I was, more or less freshly out of grad school, full of ideas. And I thought this was just a fantastic opportunity. So that's kind of how we ended up producing a few papers. So we had a couple of projects with him that were on this topic of trade and quality, but never really engaging with what is firm productivity, what drives it. And of course, I knew about Nick's ongoing work on management practices. So the project started by Ji Hong and I thinking about trade and management, thinking, okay, we're just going to bring in this world management surveys for China, see what happens. That was very quick for us to operationalize. And there was quite a bit of cool results there. But then I was talking to Nick about it, and we realized this was around the time when they were getting the first wave of the US census that was that included those same questions. And we kind of realized it would be absolutely fascinating to essentially replicate the study with the US data. And so it was a no-brainer. And Nick was working with Steve at the time. And so he was kind of the one engaging with the data. It was tricky to put everything together because, you're working with different data sets that are proprietary in different locations. It's not just the time difference, but also just kind of, there was a government shutdown in the US for a few months. Stephen was on the market. He graduated and went to Hong Kong. We had these phone calls when like one of us is in California, one of us is in the UK, one of us is in China. I mean, it's crazy. But hey, it came together and the results were really kind of consistent across the board.
Yeah. That's the government shutdown made me smile because I think you get good practice for then the next few terms, so that can be quite good. Okay, so yeah, leave a little bit more time for those of you guys who haven't taken the survey yet. I would like to ask you a question. If we have no question from the audience, I don't think anyone left anything in the chat. Where this project sits in your research agenda, and in general, do you see consistency in the projects that you work on? How do you think about that? Do you think in terms of portfolio, or do you think more in isolated?
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. I think in grad school, you're always told that you need to like carve a path for yourself and you have to have a research agenda that's sort of forward-looking. I think that's not easy to do, especially early on when you're starting out, because you want to explore different directions. Plus, one of the greatest joys and freedoms in our profession is that you can work on whatever it is you're excited about. And of course, the way we learn about literatures is naturally going to lead to kind of this gradual progression, and you are going in the same direction. You're not spreading yourself too thin. In my case, I started out working on trade with financial frictions, moved on to multinationals and value chains with financial frictions. But throughout that whole agenda, which is still ongoing in a way, like I was always interested in firm heterogeneity. And so kind of going from that to thinking about trade and quality was a bit of a step into the unknown. Once I had those two projects, though, on trade and quality, the management practices was a very natural next step. I will be honest, at the time, I thought that I would continue working with the management practices kind of idea. I thought there would be follow-up work on management and multinationals, management and kind of production networks. I think part of it was data issues, part of it was conceptual. Why I moved on from that. I have been working on multinationals and production networks since, but not really with this management angle. So firm heterogeneity stayed with me, and what's been super useful and kind of implicitly embedded in my work is thinking about firms' global sourcing decisions, and how you combine inputs to make stuff and why one makes you successful with the other, but not necessarily the management angle.
Mhm. It's interesting. Is it because of sort of feasibility issues? I mean, often the feasibility set sometimes expands, sometimes contracts, right? As you experience, you realize, in fact, the first best I cannot do, and then the second best doesn't look so good. So how do you think about these things? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's both push and pull. It's hard to know which one's stronger. I struggle to say no, which is a problem. I spread myself too thin, but I think there was a lot of a pull in that there were new ideas, new data sets, new project opportunities, which kind of moved me more in this direction of production networks. I think this was already happening when I was kind of nearing my tenure clock, but there's also this push to be at the cutting edge. And I felt like going into this production network literature is where it was at. And so I had to make that transition. Part of it was visibility. So part of it was a push in the sense that it felt like I wouldn't describe it as a dead end. But this paper, unfortunately, I've done that in the past as well with my work. It does sit between chairs. And it was interesting. It makes for a great talk. You have a blast presenting to different audiences, conferences in different fields, seminars across the broad department range, but it's not easy to get published. And I think that was not a bit of a push factor. Okay, stay in your lane a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it highlights this tension in terms of innovation when bringing two different fields together, right? Can really push the innovation frontier, but at the same time, that makes it much harder to categorize.
Yeah.
And you face these constraints. Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting. Vassal, how are we doing on the?
I think we are ready to go. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to compare the audience's responses to what you said. So this is it's interesting because I've already seen what your response is to this. And yeah, anyway, so how many years do you think it took the researchers to go from conceiving the idea to getting it published? This is the distribution of audience responses. And what you said was 7. So this is kind of the reason why we do the behind the scenes, because
Yeah, exactly.
most of the audience has underestimated.
So this paper was published in 21. It was published in 21. It was accepted in 2020. And I didn't remember the timeline. So I went back. And the only way I could retrace my steps was I looked at Dropbox and I could see that there were some concept notes from 2013. Okay, I wasn't sure how to count that, but like by 2014, Jihong and I were doing some stuff with the Chinese data. There were some preliminary results. I went into my email and also kind of did some triangulation that way, and I could see that the US data came online, came on board a bit later. Yeah, so that's how it ended up. But remember, there was a government shutdown. The publication process was not, I'm happy to talk about it, it was not as long as for other projects, I think. But maybe like from journal to journal, about a year and not a revision and so on. So we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay, so this is a question we ask all our speakers, which is compared to your other projects, is this below or above the median?
I'm afraid to say it's about average.
Okay.
There have been a few projects that have been very fast, but this is not unusual for me.
Okay. All right. So let's take a couple of more questions and then we can chat again. So the next question we asked was, how many times do you think the paper was presented? And you said more than 4 times, and that's exactly what the audience said as well. I think Sev and I discussed this last time. Maybe we need to shift it so that more than 4 times, because everyone presents it more than 4 times.
Honestly, I think you should be talking like 4 or 40, right? Because like I'm sure it's more than 20, 30, who knows?
Yeah. All right. Um, And then we've got, how many journals do you think the researchers submitted the paper before it was accepted? And here you said two, and that's what most of the audience guessed as well.
I want to comment on that. I'm not sure if I've learned a lesson. So in grad school, I went to Harvard. I was brainwashed to never co-author with senior people. Obviously, Nick and John were senior to me at the time. I do regret not having co-authored with more senior people earlier on because I think you learn a lot from that experience. And there were people in my cohort who I could see were kind of progressing differently in their publication path. I think there's also a bit of hysteresis in publication. In any case, this was their call. So we tried two top fives. I think it was AER and QG. Again, I remembered none of this. Okay. So I went back to my Dropbox. So apparently we tried QG and AER and they were quick. And then we went to Restat where the paper came out. And it was by far the best. I think that and one other paper, the JIE, are by far the easiest revisions. So at the Restat, well, we'll talk about this next. But yeah, so I have independently made a mistake of doing too many journals, I think. And so this was interesting for me that after one or two, they were like, no, we're dropping down a notch. And there was some rewriting in between. So I do more of that these days. Fewer journals, more rewriting if the reports are good.
Mhm. All right. Okay. Um, the next question was how many rounds of revision. So we can take the two questions about peer review once, and then we can discuss that.
Yeah.
So you said there was one round of revision. And how many months it took you to do it? That's the next question. Wow, that's a lot of variance. And you said 14. So again, a majority of the audience underestimated how much time it took to do.
Oh no, this is extremely naive. I'm shocked people thought it would take this quick. No, so in terms of rounds, like I said, there've only been two papers that were this quick.
Mhm.
One revision, pretty substantive, but a very clear path, knew what needed to happen. Yes, we added a few more of these causality things, but it was very clear that it would work. And in the second round, he basically accepted. It took us, I went back, I did not recall any of this. The reason it took us this long was because Stephen was on the market and there was a government shutdown for 2 or 3 months. So apparently, Restart had given us a 1 year deadline. And apparently I sent an email to request an extension and it ended up being 14 months. And I take full credit for this because these last 13, 14 months when I was writing everything, yes, I was basically 2 months pregnant and I was falling off my chair. I never vomited actually, but I was so sick I could barely sit upright. Yeah. So most other papers go through two serious revisions. My job market paper had 3 rounds and it took like more than 2 years on their desk, plus revisions on my end. It was really stressful.
Okay. At this point, do we have any questions from Seb? Do you have a question, or do we have questions from the audience as well? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at any point.
I mean, the one thing I would like to ask, so you're talking about your job market paper, how long it sits, and how do we improve? the situation, because it seems like we are quite an outlier in economics in terms of revision times and processing times in general. And it
Yeah.
seems like a lot of it is actually authors spending a huge amount of time addressing reviewers' comments, which are often very long. How do we improve this?
So let me give you some good news. Since I would know this, Seven I on the Restart board of editors. So my job market paper came out at the Restart before the Restart kind of upped its game. So I think these days journals are very aware of their statistics and they analyze them much more carefully than before. And so I think that the turnaround time has really improved. And for most journals, you get a first response kind of within 3 months is the goal. And a few of them actually hit it. And for most of them, I think 6 months is really the cut. There are very, very few exceptions. And journals go after those problematic editors. I think what I've also noticed, I want to say it's in the last 5 years, whenever I've been invited to referee by like a new editor at a journal, I've noticed they sent a longer email where they kind of almost state their vision as an editor and how they actively want to promote faster turnaround times and a fairer review process, fair to the author and to the paper. Our job is not to be rewriting papers. Our job is to improve the papers, be their best version, and clearly say no when it's a no. And so all of the editors these days kind of prompt you to organize your remarks into kind of main, critical, do or die, and essentially optional. They call them minor, but they're optional. What I think is critical is for editors to be very conscientious in communicating what needs to happen to the author. That takes time. So you need, editors are always like brilliant people, okay? So they're intellectually capable. The question is, are they going to be good citizens to put in the time? And are they good decision makers? To kind of sit down and say, this is what needs to happen. And obviously some projects lend themselves better to this than others. But both as a referee, I'm pedantic about reading what the other referees have said, what the editor has said. And, when I review a revision, I bear that in mind. I don't insist on only my own thing. I kind of know that the author is handling this revision holistically. And kind of as a referee, as also as an author, I really appreciate it when the editor takes a stance and provides more guidance. And then the last thing is to all of us, I think, as referees. So it's interesting. I've been having these conversations with people both in the US and Europe, different cohorts. And there is a sense in which the pendulum tends to swing. And I'm sure this varies from field to field. In trade lately, it's become a lot more kind of structural, technical counterfactuals. Papers are huge. They'll have amazing data. So like 10, 15 years ago, the whole paper is just like the data and stylized facts and simple toy model, bunch of regressions. These days, that's like a third of the paper because then comes the estimation and the counterfactuals. It's never enough. There is a risk of losing the idea, losing sight of the forest for the trees when you start obsessing about technicality. So that's kind of where I stand. And so, yeah, I've been having this conversation with lots of people that like a lot of referees are becoming super technical. This is a reflection of what's happening in my field. In other fields, it might take a different direction, but yes, the pendulum does swing. So I think in those circumstances, the editor plays a very important role.
All right. Thank you. So I have one more question just to decompose the peer review process a bit more. How much time did you take between the submission to the first two journals and then to Restat? And what kind of comments did you receive, if that's something you can share? And how did the paper change through that? And that relates to, I think, our next question also on how aligned were your priors with the things that you find? And where you said it was perfectly aligned, most people thought it was mostly aligned. And how many times did the pitch change, which I guess would be a part of the peer review process as well. So you
Yeah. So it's interesting. So with this paper, nobody was taking issue with the empirics, but there was a lot of discussion of what the main takeaway is and what management is. And I think it's because we fell between chairs. And so essentially, I did not review the reports we got, so this is kind of my recollection, might not be accurate. I think the comments were about what is management? Is it productivity? Is it an endogenous choice? And therefore, all the empirics correlations between joint outcomes of the firm problem, or are you trying to argue that management causally, causes and drives these things? And so changing the pitch was about that. And so I think there was a time when it was mostly a trade and quality paper, and instead of productivity, we had management. Then we kind of made it more about, oh, but wait a moment, there's this also open puzzle in the management literature, which I wasn't aware of. Like it was that came from Nick and John of like, why is management good? We know management is positively correlated with profits, but why? We don't know. And I was like, okay, well, the trade data is so much richer than what you normally do in those management papers that you can actually try to unpack those mechanisms of productivity and quality capacity. And so that was kind of a big change in the pitch for us. I don't know if to think of it as like one or two things, but one was the causality versus correlation and engaging with this like TFPR versus management thing. And then the other one was, who are you talking to? Are you anchored in trade? Are you anchored in management? Yeah, I'm not sure. I think at the end of the day, that's where we fell between chairs with the top fives. Whereas at Reset, I think we just, the Reset has this, to me, reputation of being a bit more open-minded and focused on the idea than some of the technicality. And I think we were lucky also with the editor there, who I think this kind of work appealed to him a lot. In other projects, it's been interesting. So in that sense, it was perfectly aligned for me because I thought that like this was absolutely reasonable. That's not the experience I've had in every project. There have been projects where, you know, we've gotten pushback from referees on the theory, on the empirics, on the mapping between the two, which has caused frustration because I'm like, okay, how, like, I thought we had explained it as clearly as possible. This makes so much sense to me. Whenever I present, it makes sense to people. I don't understand where these referees are coming from. So that's kind of frustrating. Yeah, and in other projects, I'm having to pivot more than I did for this one.
All right. Because you also spoke about the size of the papers increasing over time and how there are various elements to papers, the decision to go with two different countries, was that from the get-go, or is that something that also got added over time?
It did get added, but fairly early on. So, like I said, we started out with Jihong doing this with China, but there were many fewer firms in a way. And when we started talking to Nick and John, we weren't sure if it would be two separate papers from one paper. There was a possibility that the US patterns would look so different that essentially would tell us that these two countries are very different because of institutions or market frictions. The market for managers is different. Everything is different. So maybe we should treat each one separately because each one will allow us to study a different mechanism at play. Because the results were looking so similar, consistently similar, we decided to just put it all together. Yeah. But it's unusual. I'm trying to think. There is one project. Yes. So I have another paper that's going through the referring process, which started out similarly, where we're looking at how the market structure upstream in China affects sourcing decisions for downstream firms in France. Paper started with 3 people. We were looking at Chinese and French data. It was awesome. I have a fantastic former PhD student, now postdoc of mine from Chile, and we had projects with him with Chilean data, which is better than the French and the Chinese data. Okay, the details don't matter, but you can see more there that you don't in the French and Chinese data. And so we were like, okay, maybe we should check if the Chilean data behaves the same as the French data. And we can do some additional checks on the Chilean data that we cannot with the French data. So that's why we brought him on board and that data. I think it made for a stronger paper, but I'll tell you, as the paper is now going through the refereeing process, some of the referees have commented on this, like, why do you have both France and Chile? Do you need both?
Yeah. Okay. So then we had a question, which is, once the pitch was finalized, how many times do you think the introduction was changed purely for stylistic reasons? And here you said 3 to 5 times. I'm assuming this is also something that evolved through the refereeing process or was done much before submitting.
Frankly, I did not remember, but I think a bit of both. And I'm also extrapolating from my current editing style. I edit a lot, and kind of the abstract in the introduction is your calling card. And I do edit introductions quite substantively. Part of it is that, okay, so I think when I was a rookie, I first wrote drafts, then made slides and presented the paper. And that has really changed. That now that's like upside down. So I kind of first start presenting papers with some slides and a bit of a draft. And the two keep evolving. And so a lot of the editing, specifically the introduction, not so much the meat of the paper, but specifically the abstract in the introduction, is because when we've decided to submit, I reread it and I'm like, oh, that's terrible. When I present, when I speak around the slides, this is what I say, and this is why I know it works better conceptually. And then, so basically, we're not saying some of the things we should be saying in the introduction, and the things that we are saying, we're saying in the wrong order. And so that's why I think I rewrite intros.
Amazing. That is incredibly helpful to hear. So I think then we are left with two more questions, after which we can also open it to the audience for questions. So this was about how challenging each of these different components of the research process were for you. So you see the audience's responses here. So everyone seems to have thought that data collection was the most challenging for this paper. And your responses are right here, where you said something similar. And let's do the one on time use as well, and then you can comment, which is what took the most time. This is what the audience said. So this is consistent. They thought that data collection would have taken 23% of the time, and then data analysis. And interesting. Okay, so for you, data collection didn't
Let
actually
me
take.
just tell you that I really struggle with this question for two
Right.
reasons. One is that I do not remember, and memory is selective. And two, it's a research team. Different people do different things. So I was trying to figure, I don't know, I wasn't sure, first of all, how much time my co-authors have spent on different things. And even if I knew that, should I be answering about myself or the team? I think it's hard. I think if you ask me about an ongoing project, I'll probably have a more informed, a more accurate, not a more informed, a more accurate response. Yeah.
Yeah. But in general, do you think that do you agree with the audience's prediction here that data collection was indeed the most challenging thing about this paper?
So, okay. So I think it's bizarre, but these days I don't touch data. I'm still obsessively close to data. Okay. So I literally know missing observations, like how things get coded, how things get, manipulated, expanded, all of that. Because that's the kind of the level of discussion with co-authors, but I don't actually touch it. I think most of the data that my co-authors access is increasingly clean. It's, it takes time to access if you need to navigate administrative processes. And in some countries, it's easier than in others. So actually, it's not so much the collection as much as the data analysis. For this project, obviously, there was serious data collection involved, but that John and Nick did. So I wasn't really part of that effort. And so for me, kind of where my value added and time allocation is the research design, which is an iterative process. There's a big push early on, but it continues throughout to keep the project on track. And then I'm the writer, I'm the presenter.
So, Kalina, you mentioned the idea of delegating, I guess, with data analysis. And have you thought about this over time? And is that something that you find easy or challenging? Have you approached that? For instance, I've experienced myself this more recently of not being in the data myself. I find it much harder to give instructions or have conversations with co-authors. How do you overcome this hurdle? And more generally, how do you think about delegating?
Yeah. I think for me, it happened gradually and organically over time. I think I was used to doing absolutely everything myself. And if anything, I think of myself as, well, I'm not sure how I think of myself anymore. I used to think of myself as an empiricist who would do some applied theory, but I think these days I think I do both theory and empirics. I don't do counterfactuals. I don't do structural estimation. That's clearly my co-authors. But I think over time, I started collaborating with people with access to data. And so part of it happened, I had no choice. I was not a US citizen, so I could not go and work with the US data on multinationals. I couldn't get my hands on the Chinese data directly. Same thing with the German data, the Danish data, the Belgian data. And so it wasn't by choice, but actually I've grown to really like it because it helps me. It's very liberating. I feel like I think better. It's like you have some distance, so you could focus on the research design. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we do discuss really nitty-gritty details of the data, like what is a data structure, what is a variable, what are the different entries, how do we clean it up, how do we extract what we want? But I can then kind of conceptually focus on actually, these are the variables we want to construct from this data, so therefore we need to manipulate it in this way. Or, this is the empirical specification I want to write in like your world. Let's try to do it. And then, when we all agree on that, I don't check the code very often. I kind of trust the people I work with. So in that sense, I've learned to delegate, I guess. But problems come up all the time, right? Like as we're reviewing tables together, even though I don't touch the data, maybe precisely because of that, I'm like, wait a moment, what happened to the number of observations here? What just happened? Or like, why are you doing logs here? What's going on? There must be an issue here. So, it actually, in my experience, it has ended up working really well because we see different things.
All right, thank you. So if there's something about the behind the scenes that you want to reveal which we've not discussed already, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll also open it up to the audience to ask you questions.
Oh, I think it's best to get questions. I can always talk more, but I think it's best to handle questions. Yeah.
Okay, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask Kalina any questions that you have.
Hi, Kalina.
Hi.
I'll just take the turn if nobody else does. I have a question relating to the strategic choice of the journals that you're submitting to. So you mentioned that you got very different reactions from different journals, and some of that is always some high level things that people that you know some journals do more or less. But another thing is also which I find talking to some of my co-authors the people that are sitting on these boards. So my two questions really are, how important do you think that is? How do you go about selecting the journal? And the second one, I think, for grad students, the interesting part is, well, how do you actually dig into that world where this is knowledge that you acquire over a long time, and what would you propose doing about this particular choice as a grad student?
Yeah. Um, Honestly, I think it's quite hard. I'm not sure that I can navigate the process very well. And every paper seems to have its different challenges. So, um, in my field, in international trade, we tend to fall between chairs in that it's rare to have someone who is an expert in the field as an editor. So then it becomes incumbent on whoever gets the paper to choose appropriate referees. And I think for other fields, that process is probably a little bit more predictable and smoother for that reason. Yes, I usually, I want to aim high. I do try top fives. Um, I think a couple of top fives are enough, frankly, before deciding, okay, I need to pivot. And then still a big question. Do you go to a really good but slightly lower ranked general interest journal, say like Restat or some of the AJs, or do you go to a top field journal? And I can tell you that there's so different views on this. And I remember when I was tenure track, not being amused by that at all. So trade people would think much more highly of the Journal of International Economics, like top field journal, than my non-trade colleagues at Stanford. So for them, something like the Restat would be much more preferable. AJs, I think, were hard and they remain hard for my field. So I don't know how to read them. Unfortunately, I've also, well, unfortunately, I don't know for whom. I think for the profession at the end of the day, there are all these differences in promotion process across countries, and let's not discuss where they come from, but let's just accept them at face value. And I have tenure track co-authors who are based in Asian universities, and the journals that are on their list for promotion differ. And of those on the list, the relative ranking differs. And, you might think that, I have tenure, I'm senior enough to not care about this. Well, I do, and I get extremely upset. And so I've recently, of course, I'm going to support my junior co-authors. But I was just really pissed off, frankly, that, in my mind, we had to drop down a couple of steps because of this. I would have liked to submit somewhere that would not have helped my junior co-authors get tenure. So I guess that what's the lesson? The lesson is you always try to publish as well as you can, but you also unfortunately need to be pragmatic and think about where you are in life. And if you are tenure track, then yeah, of course, you have to pay attention to what sells at your institution. So you have to be aware of that. But taking a step back, I think if you think long run, what is impact and standing in the profession? And I think senior people will be the first to tell you it's not about top fives. It's about just visibility and top few journals can actually have a lot more real impact on the profession and just kind of how research evolves. Yeah.
All right, thank you. We have time for one more question if anybody has a question.
Yeah, I was just kind of trying to get at the thinking around which projects to pursue because you want to have a coherent research agenda and like how you choose the projects and how it fits within your how do they call it, your portfolio. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I think generally, everyone you ask is probably going to give a slightly different answer. I think it's important to figure out what works for you. So I think you want to be productive, and I would personally be more productive if I'm excited about the project and I enjoy it, and I enjoy the research team as well. And I have had projects where that was not the case, or not to the same extent, and I just decided that it's not worth it. And so I think I have not been terribly strategic in my choice of projects. You might have been a little bit naive. It's interesting because I remember early on, it's so weird. Like the advice you get is not always the best advice. So I remember, coming out of a top department, going tenure track at a top department, people tell you swing for the fences and cut everything else. That was not my personality. I was too risk averse. Plus, outside the top 10 schools, this is a recipe for disaster. You need numbers. And so you need to think about your portfolio holistically. So whether you're naive or strategic, I think the answer is you need multiple projects. And some they're going to publish in different kinds of journal. But I'm not even going to call them higher quality, lower quality, or higher impact, lower impact. There's going to be some horizontal differentiation and some vertical differentiation. And even if you want to just think about it purely strategically, the way you make a name for yourself, for the longest time, I was known for someone in trade and finance, and I was very happy about that. It was fantastic to see essentially a new subfield emerge. But at some point, I also felt very confined by that. I was like, well, hello, I moved on to thinking about firm heterogeneity and production networks. Why are people still introducing me as a trade and finance person, right? So there's a healthy balance there. But I think, yes, the way you build a name for yourself, yes, you have an anchor paper that's a top 5, but then you do need a few others that are perfectly good papers in field journals or lower ranked general interest journals. So for me, that happened organically. But I think strategically, this is probably also the best you can do.
Okay.
The other thing to be mindful of is that there's a lot of ex post rationalization. So it's really, really hard. Like I'm giving you a backward looking answer, trying to remember how I thought about it at the time, right? But there's a lot of ex post rationalization.
Which as behavioral economists, we feel it. Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for the time you've dedicated to this. I hope that it was an interesting experience for you to also kind of reflect back and see that brings like a new way of also approaching your research. I mean that's not like something we have a lot of we don't have that many occasions to do this.
Yeah,
So
I think it's true. I think it was true. I enjoyed that. Doing that detective work yesterday, trying to figure out when did this paper start?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much for this. And it was wonderful to hear about your research